London, 1815. The crisp autumn morning at Blackwood Manor shattered into chaos as two burly constables burst through the kitchen doors, their heavy boots tracking mud across the freshly scrubbed floor. Cook dropped her rolling pin with a clatter as they seized young Thomas Harper by his arms, nearly lifting the slender kitchen boy off his feet, his face drained of color as they announced their purpose, voices booming through the suddenly silent kitchen. The diamond and sapphire necklace of Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood, had been discovered missing from her jewelry case, and evidence pointed to Thomas as the thief. The household staff gathered in horrified clusters, maids covering their mouths with trembling hands, footmen exchanging worried glances, as Thomas struggled against the iron grip of the law. "I did not steal anything. I swear it," he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation, his usually calm demeanor fracturing under the weight of the accusation. The commotion drew attention from above stairs, and the great oak doors leading to the main hall swung open to reveal the Duchess herself, Eleanor Blackwood, standing at the top of the grand staircase. She appeared as though carved from marble, her slender figure draped in blue morning silk, her face ashen and eyes suspiciously red-rimmed. The servants immediately bowed their heads in deference, but Thomas looked directly up at her, his green eyes locking with hers in a gaze that seemed to contain volumes of unspoken words. "I am innocent, Your Grace," he pleaded, even as the constables began dragging him toward the door. For a moment, something flickered across the Duchess's beautiful face, a spasm of what might have been anguish, before she turned away, unable to bear the sight. A single tear slid down her pale cheek as Thomas was pulled roughly through the doorway, his final desperate protest echoing through the cavernous entrance hall. The Duke appeared beside his wife, a tall, imposing figure, with silver-streaked dark hair and cold eyes that revealed nothing as he watched the scene below with detached interest. His hand came to rest possessively on the small of the Duchess's back, a gesture that caused her to stiffen almost imperceptibly. "Take the thief to await proper justice," he commanded, his deep voice resonating with authority. "Let it be known that crimes against the House of Blackwood will not go unpunished." As Thomas was led away, the Duchess suddenly gripped the banister, her knuckles white against the polished wood. The housekeeper rushed forward, concerned that Her Grace might faint, but Eleanor waved her away, composing herself with visible effort. The Duke guided his wife back toward their private quarters, his expression satisfied, while the servants below exchanged glances laden with confusion and suspicion. For in that brief, charged moment when the Duchess and the kitchen boy had locked eyes, more than a few had noticed something passing between them, something that spoke not of theft and betrayal, but of a secret far more dangerous in the rigid world of 1815 aristocracy. 1 month before the fateful arrest, Duchess Eleanor Blackwood sat alone in her opulent chambers, watching the late afternoon light filter through heavy velvet curtains that seemed to trap the air itself. She stared at her reflection in the gilded vanity mirror, hardly recognizing the elegant, composed woman who gazed back at her. 5 years of marriage to the Duke of Blackwood, 30 years her senior, had gradually dimmed the light in her eyes, replaced with a carefully maintained mask of aristocratic serenity that revealed nothing of the emptiness within. Her fingers absently traced the diamond and sapphire necklace that adorned her throat, a wedding gift from the Duke that felt more like a collar than an adornment, its cold weight a constant reminder of her position. The stones caught the fading sunlight, throwing prisms across the silk wallpaper, beautiful and lifeless as her existence had become. Behind her, Martha, her lady's maid, moved quietly about the room, selecting the appropriate gown for yet another tedious evening, where Eleanor would sit in perfect silence at the end of the dining table while her husband and his political allies discussed reform bills and foreign policy as though she were nothing more than an ornamental fixture. The Duke had made it abundantly clear from the beginning that he had married her for her family connections and youthful beauty, not for her mind or companionship. He neither sought nor valued her opinions, viewing her primary purpose as providing an heir for his ancient title, a duty at which she had thus far failed. Martha fastened the last of the pearl buttons running down the back of Eleanor's evening gown, a creation of emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair, but seemed to drain what little color remained in her cheeks. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone truly sees me at all," Eleanor confessed softly, the words slipping out before she could reclaim them. Martha paused, her hands hovering over the elaborate arrangement of curls she had just finished pinning into place. Her eyes met the Duchess's in the mirror, momentarily startled by this rare glimpse behind her mistress's careful facade. Eleanor immediately regretted the moment of vulnerability, forcing her lips into the practiced smile that had become her armor against the loneliness that threatened to consume her. The dinner bell echoed through the vast corridors of Blackwood Manor, summoning her to another evening of elegant suffocation. She rose from her dressing table, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her gown, and steeled herself for the performance ahead. Each step down the grand staircase felt like moving deeper into a beautiful prison, her jewels catching the light of 100 candles, dazzling and distracting from the quiet desperation in her heart. The Duke waited at the bottom of the stairs, his tall figure still commanding despite his advancing years, his eyes appraising her appearance with the detached interest of a man examining a prized possession. He offered his arm with practiced courtesy, leading her toward the dining room where his guests awaited. Eleanor slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, her touch light, her smile perfect, her soul crying out for something, anything, that might feel like genuine human connection in this gilded cage she called home. The sweltering heat of Blackwood Manor's vast kitchen seemed not to touch Thomas Harper as he moved with quiet efficiency between tasks, his lean frame bending to stoke the fire, his quick hands chopping vegetables with precision that belied his mere 3 weeks of employment. Mrs. Winters, the formidable head cook who had ruled this domain for nearly 2 decades, watched the newest addition to her kitchen staff with growing approval, noting how he anticipated needs before they were voiced and completed each task without complaint or error. Unlike the other kitchen boys who had come and gone, this one possessed a certain refinement that piqued her curiosity, for despite his threadbare clothes and the calluses on his hands, Thomas Harper carried himself with unusual dignity. During the brief moments of respite between breakfast service and preparations for luncheon, while other servants gossiped or dozed on sacks of flour, Thomas would retreat to a quiet corner near the pantry window, where light filtered through dusty panes. From his pocket, he would withdraw a small, well-worn volume of poetry, his eyes moving across the pages with evident absorption, his lips occasionally forming the words silently as though tasting their syllables. The first time Mrs. Winters had discovered him thus engaged, she had nearly scolded him for idleness until she realized what he was doing, her astonishment rendering her momentarily speechless at the sight of a kitchen boy reading Wordsworth with apparent understanding. This peculiarity had not gone unnoticed by the other servants, whose whispers about the new boy grew more elaborate with each passing day. Some claimed he was the disgraced son of a merchant, others suggested he might be a gentleman fallen on hard times, while the more romantically inclined scullery maids speculated he could be a nobleman in disguise, working beneath his station for reasons of intrigue or broken heart. Thomas neither confirmed nor denied these rumors, responding to direct questions with polite vagueness that somehow discouraged further inquiry without seeming rude. Mr. Phillips, the butler, had initially viewed Thomas with suspicion, unusual education in servants, often leading to discontent and ideas above their station, but even he had grudgingly acknowledged the boy's exemplary work and respectful demeanor. "The boy has the hands of a worker, but the mind of a scholar," Mrs. Winters remarked to Mrs. Chambers, the housekeeper, as they observed Thomas explaining to a scullery maid why certain spices complemented particular meats, his explanation revealing knowledge of chemistry that went far beyond kitchen lore. When questioned about his background, Thomas would simply explain that his father had been employed as secretary to a country vicar who believed education should not be limited by station, allowing Thomas access to books and learning normally denied to those of his class. The truth, which he kept carefully guarded, was considerably more complex, involving a father who had sacrificed everything to educate his son in hopes of a better future, only to die of consumption before seeing those dreams realized, leaving Thomas with knowledge ill-suited to his new economic circumstances and responsibilities, to a mother and sister who now relied on his wages. As Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and returned to preparing vegetables for the Blackwood family's luncheon, he remained unaware that his presence in this great house would soon catalyze events that would forever alter not only his own destiny, but that of the melancholy Duchess who moved through gilded rooms above, as trapped in her world of privilege as he was in his of service. Dawn painted Blackwood Manor in gentle brushstrokes of pink and gold, the gardens still wrapped in morning mist as Eleanor slipped through the small side door normally used only by gardeners. These stolen moments before the household awakened were her sole reprieve from the suffocating propriety that governed her existence, the only time she could breathe freely without the weight of the Duchess title pressing upon her shoulders. She wore only a simple walking dress and light shawl, her auburn hair loosely braided rather than elaborately styled, making her appear younger and less formal than the composed figure who presided over formal dinners. The dew-dampened grass soaked the hem of her dress as she followed the winding path toward her favorite sanctuary, a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree hidden from view of the manor windows. As she rounded the hedge that concealed this private retreat, Eleanor stopped abruptly, discovering her secret place already occupied. A young man sat beneath the spreading branches, his back against the trunk, a small notebook balanced on his knee as his pencil moved swiftly across the page, his profile intent and absorbed in his task. Eleanor recognized him instantly as one of the new kitchen servants, though she had only glimpsed him briefly during her infrequent visits to the domestic regions of the house. Hearing her approach, Thomas looked up, his expression transforming from peaceful concentration to horrified embarrassment in an instant. He scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping his notebook, his face flushing crimson as he recognized the Duchess standing before him in the early morning light. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon," he stammered, bowing deeply, his voice cultured despite his obvious distress. "I know servants are not permitted in the formal gardens. I shall return to my duties immediately." Eleanor should have been affronted by this trespass, should have nodded coldly and watched him retreat to his proper place below stairs. But something in his manner, the notebook now hastily closed in his hand, sparked a curiosity that overrode convention. "What were you writing?" she asked softly, surprising herself as much as the young man before her. Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between the truth and a more prudent answer. "Poetry, Your Grace," he finally admitted, his eyes lowering respectfully, but not before she caught a flash of intelligence and passion that struck her with unexpected force. Eleanor moved closer, her interest genuinely piqued for the first time in months. "May I see?" she requested, extending her hand, watching as uncertainty warred with the impossibility of refusing a duchess. Reluctantly, Thomas offered the notebook, and Eleanor leafed through pages filled with graceful handwriting and verses that revealed both education and sensitivity unusual in a kitchen servant. "You have talent," she observed, returning the book with genuine appreciation. "I myself find great solace in poetry, particularly Wordsworth and Byron." Thomas looked up, momentary surprise overcoming his careful deference as he responded with unexpected fervor. "Words are the only freedom some of us have, Your Grace," he said, before realizing his boldness and adding hastily, "Forgive my impertinence." But Eleanor was not offended, instead finding herself strangely moved by the simple truth in his statement. In that suspended moment, as mist curled around the ancient oak and birdsong heralded the new day, something indefinable passed between the Duchess and the kitchen boy, a recognition of kindred spirits trapped in vastly different cages, a connection that transcended the immutable boundaries of class and position that governed their world. In the weeks that followed their dawn encounter beneath the oak tree, Eleanor found herself drawn to the gardens with increasing frequency, her steps unconsciously seeking the quiet corners where she might once again cross paths with the servant who wrote poetry. What began as seemingly chance meetings soon evolved into something deliberate yet unspoken, a secret choreography that brought them together in the hidden spaces of Blackwood Manor. The pattern established itself with subtle inevitability. Eleanor lingering in the old greenhouse while examining exotic orchids just as Thomas arrived to deliver fresh herbs to the gardener, or Thomas dusting volumes in the vast library precisely when the Duchess chose to select a new book for her afternoon reading. Each time, proper acknowledgements were exchanged for the benefit of any who might observe them, but when certain of privacy, their conversations flowed with growing ease, transcending the boundaries that society had placed between them. During one such encounter in the abandoned East Wing Conservatory, where sunlight streamed through dusty glass and long-neglected plants created a wild, secluded bower, Thomas cautiously shared the story of his past, revealing how his father had served as secretary and assistant to an eccentric scholar with progressive ideas about education. "I was apprenticed to Professor Winters at Cambridge, preparing to enter university myself," Thomas explained as they sat amid the forgotten greenery, Eleanor perched on a stone bench while he remained standing as propriety demanded, though the distance between them diminished with each meeting. "But then my father contracted consumption, and with his passing went all financial support. My mother and sister rely on my wages now, so here I am, chopping onions instead of translating Greek." Eleanor listened, captivated not only by his story, but by the dignity with which he recounted his reversal of fortune, without bitterness or self-pity. She found herself sharing confidences in return, speaking of her own childhood dreams of becoming a writer, ambitions gently but firmly extinguished by parents who saw her only as marriage material, her value measured solely in terms of the advantageous alliance she might secure. As spring advanced, warming the air and coaxing blossoms from every branch, they exchanged books and poems, Thomas discreetly leaving volumes marked with pressed flowers at their meeting places, Eleanor responding with notes hidden between pages, their literary discussions becoming increasingly intertwined with personal revelations. The intellectual connection that had initially drawn them together deepened into something more profound, a recognition of kindred spirits trapped in lives neither had chosen freely. During a particularly golden afternoon in the wildflower meadow beyond the formal gardens, as bees hummed among lavender and foxgloves, Eleanor watched Thomas speaking passionately about a poem he had discovered, his face animated with intelligence and sensitivity that no kitchen drudgery could diminish. "In these moments with you, I forget that I am a duchess and you are a servant," she confessed suddenly, her voice soft but clear in the warm air. "I am simply Eleanor, a woman who loves poetry and conversation, who longs for understanding." Thomas fell silent, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings that grew more dangerous with each clandestine meeting. Neither acknowledged the precipice toward which they were inexorably moving, the impossible chasm between their worlds that no amount of shared literature could bridge, yet neither could bring themselves to end these precious interludes that had become essential to their existence, like water to parched earth or sunlight to winter-dormant flowers. The late spring evening had brought distinguished guests to Blackwood Manor, the dining table extended to its full, impressive length, and laden with silver and crystal that glittered in the candlelight. The Duke sat at the head, commanding the conversation as always, while Eleanor presided at the opposite end, her posture perfect, her emerald dinner gown complementing the diamonds at her throat. The conversation had turned to literature, specifically the controversial works of Lord Byron, whose personal scandals were as discussed as his poetry in London society. Eleanor, who had been silently attending to her role as hostess, felt a flicker of genuine interest for the first time that evening. "I found his Childe Harold quite moving in its depiction of solitude and alienation," she offered during a momentary lull, her voice soft but clear, the words inspired by recent discussions with Thomas, who had introduced her to passages she had never encountered in her sheltered reading. The table fell silent, not in consideration of her point but in surprise at her unexpected contribution. The Duke, who had been expounding on Byron's moral failings rather than his literary merits, turned his cold gaze toward his wife, his wineglass paused halfway to his lips. "My dear," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "ladies rarely grasp the political implications of Byron's work, mistaking emotional indulgence for profound thought. Perhaps you might favor us with opinions on needlework or flower arrangements, subjects better suited to the feminine understanding. Laughter rippled around the table, the gentlemen raising their glasses in appreciation of the Duke's wit while the ladies exchanged knowing glances, their own intelligence similarly dismissed on countless occasions. Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks, the humiliation burning more fiercely for having momentarily forgotten her prescribed role in this carefully orchestrated performance of aristocratic life. She lowered her eyes to her plate, her appetite vanishing as she maintained the pleasant smile expected of her through 3 more excruciating courses. Later, when the guests had departed, and they retired to their private chambers, the Duke followed Eleanor into her room, dismissing her maid with a curt gesture. His tall figure loomed in the doorway, watching as she removed her jewelry with trembling fingers. That display at dinner was most unseemly, he stated without preamble, his voice hard with displeasure. I did not marry a bluestocking, nor do I wish to be contradicted in my own home. Eleanor turned to face him, summoning what dignity she could. I merely offered an opinion on the literature being discussed, she responded quietly, knowing even as she spoke that any defense would only further provoke his ire. The Duke crossed the room in 3 swift strides, his face uncomfortably close to hers, the scent of brandy heavy on his breath. You were not brought into this family for your mind, Duchess, but for your bloodline and womb, he said dismissively. Try to remember your purpose. After 5 years of marriage, I begin to question whether I made a sound investment. My sister assures me the failure to produce an heir must lie with you, as the Blackwood line has never lacked for fertility. His words struck like physical blows, each one calculated to wound where she was most vulnerable. When he finally departed, leaving her alone in the opulent chamber that felt more prison than sanctuary, Eleanor allowed the carefully maintained facade to crumble. She sank to the floor beside her bed, tears streaming unchecked down her face as she reached beneath her mattress for the small volume of poetry Thomas had given her, his own handwritten verses interspersed with published works he thought might bring her comfort. Clutching the book to her chest, Eleanor wept for the girl she had once been, full of dreams and hope, now trapped in a marriage where she was valued only as a breeding vessel for the next Blackwood heir, her mind and heart considered irrelevant to her purpose. In that moment of desolation, the connection she had formed with Thomas, tenuous and forbidden as it was, became her only lifeline to genuine human understanding in a world determined to reduce her to her most basic function. The library at Blackwood Manor stood 3 stories tall, its shelves stretching toward ornately plastered ceilings where painted muses gazed down at the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Eleanor had retreated there after another silent, tense dinner with the Duke, seeking solace in the company of books when human comfort was denied her. The vast room was normally deserted in the evenings, the family rarely troubling themselves with literature after dark, making it the perfect sanctuary for a duchess who wished to escape the suffocating attention of servants and the cold indifference of her husband. She had not expected to find anyone among the shadowed stacks, and so paused in momentary surprise upon discovering Thomas standing on the library ladder, carefully returning a volume of Shakespeare to its rightful place on the uppermost shelf. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his expression shifting from initial alarm to a warmth that made her heart quicken in her chest. Your Grace, he acknowledged, descending the ladder with graceful haste. I was just finishing my duties here. Eleanor moved further into the room, drawn by a force she neither fully understood nor wished to resist. There is no need to leave on my account, she said softly, noticing how the lamplight gilded his features, casting shadows that emphasized the clean line of his jaw and the intelligence in his eyes. I find the library rather too empty most evenings. They stood among the towering shelves, the air between them charged with unspoken awareness, the proper distance dictated by their stations somehow diminishing with each shared breath. Their conversation began cautiously, discussing the volume he had been replacing, but soon flowed into deeper waters as they spoke of dreams deferred and paths not taken. Thomas described the university career he had once imagined for himself, the scholarly life that circumstances had snatched away, while Eleanor confessed her childhood ambition to travel to Italy and Greece, to see the ancient worlds she had only encountered through books. The hours passed unnoticed as they moved among the shelves, Eleanor selecting volumes to show him passages that had moved her, Thomas responding with insights that revealed his remarkable self-education. They found themselves standing before the great library window, moonlight streaming through leaded glass to illuminate them in its silver glow, now standing close enough that the hem of her evening gown brushed against his boots. As Eleanor reached for a book he held, their fingers met briefly, the contact sending a jolt of awareness through them both. Neither moved away immediately, the forbidden touch lingering for a heartbeat too long before propriety reasserted itself, and they stepped back, the invisible boundaries of class momentarily breached but now restored. Thomas looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the space between them. "Sometimes I dream of a different life, where men like me could speak freely to women like you," he confessed, the words hanging in the still library air like a dangerous promise. Where worth might be measured by character rather than birth or title. Eleanor felt tears threatening at the truth in his words, at the impossibility they both recognized. "The world is not arranged for the happiness of individuals, Thomas," she responded softly, "but I too find myself dreaming of different possibilities." The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, breaking the spell that had enveloped them. Eleanor reluctantly moved toward the door, aware that her absence would soon be noted, while Thomas remained by the window, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. As she departed, she felt the weight of everything unsaid between them, the growing feelings that circumstances rendered forbidden, yet increasingly undeniable, emotions dangerous as fire in a house built of the driest timber. June brought Eleanor's 29th birthday, an occasion the Duke had seized upon to host the most lavish ball of the season, the invitations embossed with gold leaf and delivered to the finest families across 3 counties. The Blackwood Manor Grand Ballroom, opened only for the most significant events, gleamed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in gilded mirrors and polished marble floors, while musicians played from the gallery above and footmen in immaculate livery circulated with trays of champagne. Eleanor stood at her husband's side in a gown of midnight blue silk, her hair arranged with diamond pins that caught the light as she moved, her practiced smile firmly in place though it never reached her eyes. The Duke paraded her before their guests with the same pride he might display a particularly valuable painting or prized thoroughbred, his hand possessive at the small of her back, as he accepted compliments on her appearance with the satisfied air of an owner rather than a husband. Among the footmen serving refreshments, Eleanor spotted Thomas, pressed into service due to the scale of the event, his familiar form nearly unrecognizable in the formal Blackwood livery that rendered all servants virtually identical in their rigid perfection. Yet she would have known him anywhere, her gaze drawn to him repeatedly throughout the evening as she performed her duties as hostess, exchanging pleasantries with guests whose names and faces blurred together, while her awareness remained fixed on the servant moving quietly through the crowd. Their eyes met briefly as he offered champagne to a cluster of dowagers near the orchestra, a moment of genuine connection amid the artifice that made her heart flutter beneath the tight confines of her corset, a secret shared in plain sight of 200 oblivious witnesses. As midnight approached, the Duke called for silence, his commanding voice bringing conversations to an immediate halt as he guided Eleanor to the center of the ballroom. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he announced, his words slightly slurred from an evening of liberal indulgence in the Blackwood cellar's finest wines, "I wish to present my wife with a token of my esteem on this anniversary of her birth." A footman appeared, bearing a velvet box which the Duke opened with theatrical flourish, revealing a magnificent necklace of diamonds and sapphires, arranged in an intricate pattern that immediately drew gasps of appreciation from the assembled guests. The stones caught the candlelight and fractured it into 1,000 brilliant points, the piece clearly worth a small fortune even to the most casual observer. With a gesture that seemed more possessive than tender, the Duke moved behind Eleanor and fastened the heavy necklace around her throat, his fingers lingering at her nape in a way that made her suppress a shudder. "A fitting adornment for my most valuable possession," he declared loudly enough for all to hear, raising his glass in a toast that prompted the guests to do the same, while Eleanor stood immobile, the weight of the jewels pressing against her collarbone, like a physical manifestation of her captivity. She smiled and nodded graciously, playing her part to perfection, while feeling the cold stones against her skin as a brand of ownership rather than a gift of affection. Across the crowded ballroom, she caught Thomas's gaze once more, seeing in his eyes understanding of her true feelings in this moment of public display, a silent witness to her gilded humiliation. As the orchestra resumed and the Duke led her into the first dance, Eleanor moved with practiced grace, the necklace catching the light with each turn, marking her as the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that defined her existence and limited her freedom more effectively than any prison walls could ever do. The celebration had long since ended, the guests departed for London townhouses or nearby country estates, but Eleanor found sleep impossible, her mind racing and her skin still crawling from the memory of the Duke's possessive display. The magnificent necklace now lay in its velvet case, removed from her throat the moment she could escape to her chambers, yet she still felt its phantom weight pressing against her skin. Near 2 a.m, she wrapped herself in a dark cloak and slipped through the servants' corridors, avoiding the night watchman as she made her way to the gardens, drawn to the ancient stone maze that had stood on the Blackwood grounds since Tudor times. The night air carried the sweet scent of roses and honeysuckle, the gardens transformed by moonlight into a silvery dreamscape far removed from the stifling formality of the ballroom. Eleanor entered the maze with confidence born of countless solitary walks, following its twisting paths to the stone bench at its center, a hidden sanctuary few knew existed. She sat with her face upturned to the star-filled sky, drinking in the silence and solitude, when a soft footfall alerted her to another presence. Thomas stood at the entrance to the central clearing, still in his footman's attire, though he had removed the powdered wig and formal jacket, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Your Grace, I saw someone enter the maze and feared it might be an intruder," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should not have followed. Forgive me." Eleanor rose from the bench, her cloak falling open to reveal the simple white nightdress beneath, her hair loose around her shoulders in a manner no one but her maid had seen in years. "Do not go," she said, the words escaping before she could reconsider. "Please, Thomas, I cannot bear to be alone with my thoughts tonight." He hesitated only briefly before stepping into the moonlit clearing, keeping a respectful distance despite the absence of any witnesses to their impropriety. They spoke in hushed tones of the evening's events, Eleanor describing her feelings of humiliation at being displayed like a prized mare, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Thomas listened, his face reflecting anger on her behalf, his hands clenched at his sides as though physically restraining himself from reaching for her. The space between them seemed to contract with each passing moment, the air charged with unspoken longing that had built through weeks of stolen conversations and forbidden glances. When Eleanor faltered in her speech, a tear slipping down her cheek despite her effort at composure, Thomas moved without conscious thought, closing the distance between them to brush the moisture from her skin with gentle fingers. The touch, simple and tender, broke something within them both. Eleanor turned her face into his palm, her breath catching as their eyes met in the moonlight, and then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then with growing urgency as she responded with the passion of a woman starved for genuine human connection. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as her hands tangled in his hair, the kiss deepening until they broke apart, breathless and stunned by their own daring. "If they discovered us, you would lose everything," Thomas said, pulling away reluctantly, his voice rough with emotion, even as his eyes remained fixed on her lips. "I have nothing to lose, for nothing in my life truly belongs to me," Eleanor responded, her fingers still resting against his cheek, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration at this irrevocable crossing of boundaries. "Not my home, not my future, not even my body, which exists only to produce an heir. At least this feeling, this moment, belongs to me alone." She drew him back to her, their second kiss, slower, deeper, filled with the sweet ache of recognition between kindred spirits who had found each other against impossible odds, both knowing they had stepped onto a path from which there could be no safe return. The morning after their moonlit encounter, Eleanor entered the breakfast room with a new lightness in her step that she struggled to conceal beneath her usual reserved demeanor. Despite a nearly sleepless night, Her cheeks held a natural flush that no rouge had ever achieved, and her eyes possessed a brightness that had been absent for years. The Duke was already seated at the table, scanning correspondence while sipping his morning coffee, his silver head bent over letters bearing important seals. Eleanor murmured the appropriate greeting and took her place, keeping her gaze lowered as a footman served her tea, terrified that her face might somehow reveal the secret joy that had transformed her inner landscape. The Duke set aside his letters and observed his wife with narrowed eyes, noting the subtle changes in her appearance and manner, the way her hands trembled slightly as she stirred honey into her tea, the distracted smile that appeared and vanished when she thought herself unobserved. "You seem unusually animated this morning, my dear," he remarked casually, though his tone carried an undertone of suspicion that made Eleanor freeze momentarily. "Perhaps your birthday celebrations agreed with you more than I anticipated." She forced herself to meet his gaze with practiced composure, years of concealing her true feelings, serving her well in this moment of danger. "The ball was lovely," she responded neutrally. "You were most generous with the arrangements." The Duke continued to study her face, his expression unreadable as he sipped his coffee, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them, until interrupted by the arrival of his valet, Simmons, a thin, severe man who had served the Duke for 20 years with unwavering loyalty. The Duke beckoned him closer, murmuring instructions while Eleanor pretended absorption in her breakfast, though her appetite had vanished entirely. Later that morning, as she wrote letters in her private sitting room, Eleanor became aware of an unusual level of activity among the servants, footmen appearing in corridors where they had no business, maids lingering to dust surfaces that had been cleaned the previous day. The sensation of being watched prickled at her consciousness, confirmed when she glimpsed Simmons observing her from the gallery as she walked in the garden, his thin figure withdrawing quickly when she turned in his direction. The Duke's suspicions had been aroused, though how much he knew or guessed remained unclear, the uncertainty itself becoming a form of torment as she moved through her daily activities. 3 days later, Thomas managed to pass her a note during a chance encounter in the library, slipping the folded paper between the pages of the volume she had been examining. Eleanor waited until safely alone in her chambers before retrieving it, her heart racing at the sight of his handwriting, the page filled with poetry clearly composed for her, speaking of moonlight and forbidden joy, though bearing no signature that might identify its author. Unknown to her, this very note had been observed by a housemaid in Simmons' employ, who reported the exchange immediately to her master. That evening the Duke summoned Simmons to his study, the room dark save for a single lamp that cast long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. "Someone has caught my wife's attention," the Duke stated coldly, sliding the intercepted poem across his desk. "Find out who it is." The paper contained no name, nothing to identify its source beyond the handwriting itself, yet the content was unmistakable in its romantic intent, its references to moonlight and secret meetings damning evidence of conduct unbecoming a duchess. Despite the growing danger, Eleanor found herself unable to end her clandestine meetings with Thomas, their connection having become as essential to her as breathing. They exercised greater caution, meeting less frequently and in more secluded locations, yet both were aware of the increased scrutiny, the servants who appeared unexpectedly in previously deserted corridors, the sudden attention paid to Eleanor's movements by staff who had previously maintained a respectful distance from her private affairs. The abandoned greenhouse stood at the farthest edge of the Blackwood estate, its glass panes clouded with years of neglect, many cracked or missing entirely, allowing tendrils of ivy to creep across the iron framework. Unlike the immaculate central greenhouse where exotic specimens were cultivated for display in the manor, this forgotten structure had been deemed beyond repair and abandoned to nature's reclamation. It was here, on a humid July afternoon, that Eleanor and Thomas risked meeting, the increasing surveillance making their usual rendezvous points too dangerous. Eleanor had feigned a headache to escape afternoon calls with neighboring gentry wives, slipping away during the brief window when she knew Simmons would be attending the Duke in his dressing room. Thomas had volunteered to clear brambles from the kitchen garden, gradually working his way toward the distant greenhouse where Eleanor waited, her heart pounding with each passing minute. When he finally appeared, they embraced with the desperation of those who know their time together grows perilously short, the constant vigilance of the past weeks taking its toll on them both. "We cannot continue this way," Thomas said softly, still holding her close, his face grave with concern. "Simmons questions the staff daily, and yesterday I found him searching my few possessions in the servants' quarters." Eleanor pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in his scent as though to memorize it. "What are we to do?" she whispered, unable to imagine returning to the empty existence she had endured before knowing him, yet seeing no path forward that did not lead to disaster. Thomas drew back slightly, taking her hands in his as sunlight filtered through the dirty glass panels above, casting dappled shadows across their faces. "I have been saving every penny since my father died," he revealed, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "With careful management, I now have enough to secure passage to America for myself and my family." His eyes held hers, intense with suppressed emotion. There are opportunities there beyond anything possible here. A man may rise based on his abilities rather than his birth. Eleanor felt hope and despair surge simultaneously within her chest. "You must go," she urged, though the words felt like tearing her own heart from her body. "Take your mother and sister to safety before you are discovered." "But what of you?" he asked, his fingers tightening around hers. "I cannot bear the thought of leaving you to his cruelty." Eleanor had asked herself the same question countless times in recent days, examining her circumstances from every angle like a prisoner assessing the walls of her cell. "I have no money of my own," she admitted, the bitter reality of her dependence never more apparent than in this moment of crisis. "The Duke controls every aspect of my existence, including my finances." Then her eyes widened as inspiration struck, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat where the diamond and sapphire necklace had rested on the night of the ball. "The jewels," she said urgently. "Take my necklace. It would fund our new life." She saw the shock register on Thomas's face, quickly followed by understanding of what she was truly suggesting. Not just his escape, but their escape, together. "I could not ask that of you," he protested, though his eyes revealed the desperate hope her words had kindled. "You would be leaving everything, your position, your family, all security. I would be gaining everything that matters," Eleanor countered, suddenly certain despite the enormity of what they contemplated. "A life of my own choosing, with someone who values me for myself, rather than as property." Thomas pressed his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the humid air of the greenhouse. "We would need to act quickly," he said, practical concerns already taking shape in his mind. "The Duke has connections everywhere. Once the theft is discovered, ports will be watched, authorities alerted." Eleanor nodded, the reality of their situation bringing both fear and strange exhilaration. "Then we shall be quicker," she replied, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. 3 days hence, the Duke travels to London for parliamentary business. That is when we must act." The night chosen for the exchange of the necklace was moonless, heavy clouds obscuring the stars and promising rain before morning. Eleanor waited until well past midnight, when even the most diligent servants had retired, and the Duke had consumed enough brandy to ensure his deep sleep would not be disturbed by her movements. With trembling fingers, she retrieved the jewel case from its velvet-lined drawer in her dressing room, opening it one last time to gaze upon the glittering diamonds and sapphires that represented both her captivity and her potential freedom. She wrapped the necklace carefully, in a plain handkerchief embroidered with her initials, the only mark of ownership she dared leave on this token that would transform their futures, then slipped from her chambers wearing only her nightdress and a dark woolen shawl. The servants' corridor was narrow and dimly lit, used primarily by maids and footmen moving discreetly through the great house without disturbing its noble occupants. Eleanor had memorized the creaking boards to avoid, her bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden floors as she made her way toward the rendezvous point she and Thomas had agreed upon, a small alcove near the kitchen where linens were stored. The manor seemed to hold its breath around her, the familiar portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors watching her rebellion with painted disapproval from shadowed walls. When she reached the alcove, Thomas was already waiting, his face tense with nervous anticipation as he stepped from the shadows to meet her. The corridor was silent and appeared deserted, yet neither of them noticed the small figure crouched in the darkness behind a stack of firewood further down the passage. The scullery maid Sally, whose loyalty to Simmons had been purchased with promises of advancement and protection from the cook's frequent scolding. Eleanor pressed the handkerchief-wrapped bundle into Thomas's hands, her fingers lingering against his as the weight of the jewels passed between them. A physical manifestation of the commitment they now made to each other and the risk they undertook together. He secured the package inside his shirt, close to his heart, the precious cargo that would purchase their future now hidden from sight. 3 days from now, meet me at the village church at midnight, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silent corridor. My mother and sister will be waiting with a cart to carry us to Portsmouth. From there, we can secure passage on a merchant vessel bound for Boston. Eleanor nodded, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her at the enormity of what they planned, the comfort of the known, however oppressive, exerting its powerful pull against the terrifying freedom of an uncertain future. But looking into Thomas's eyes, seeing the tenderness and determination there, she found her resolve strengthening once more. I will be there, she promised softly. I am not afraid. Her hands betrayed her, trembling visibly despite her brave words, and Thomas captured them between his own, warming them with his touch as he had warmed her heart with his understanding. For a dangerous moment they stood too close, the temptation to embrace overwhelming, but awareness of their precarious situation kept them apart, the physical distance belying their now inextricably entwined fates. As Thomas slipped away toward the servants' quarters and Eleanor retraced her steps to her opulent prison, neither was aware of Sally scurrying through the back passages to the small chamber where Simmons slept, eager to report what she had witnessed and claim her reward for loyalty to the proper hierarchy of Blackwood Manor, setting in motion events that would bring their desperate plan crashing down around them before it had truly begun. Dawn had barely broken over Blackwood Manor when Sally, the scullery maid, crept nervously to the private quarters where Simmons maintained his sparse, meticulous rooms. She had waited through what remained of the night, too fearful to disturb the valet's rest, yet too anxious to seek her own, the weight of what she had witnessed making sleep impossible. Simmons answered her timid knock immediately, already dressed and groomed despite the early hour, his thin face betraying no surprise at her presence, as though he had expected this development. The girl stammered her report, describing in halting detail the midnight exchange between the Duchess and the kitchen boy, the wrapped package passing between them, the whispered arrangements for meeting at the village church 3 nights hence. Simmons listened in silence, his expression unchanging, save for a tightening around his colorless lips, and when Sally finished her account, he pressed a single silver coin into her palm, dismissing her with instructions to speak of this to no one. The valet moved through the quiet house like a shadow, his footsteps making no sound on thick carpets as he approached the Duke's private chambers, entering without knocking, as was his privilege after 2 decades of service. The Duke, still in his dressing gown and breaking his customary fast with strong coffee, looked up with mild irritation at this unexpected interruption of his morning routine. Your Grace, Simmons began, his voice pitched low despite the closed door and empty hallway beyond. I believe I have discovered the nature of Her Grace's inappropriate attachment. The Duke set down his cup with deliberate care, his eyes sharpening with interest as Simmons related the scullery maid's observations, including the planned escape and the mysterious package exchanged. When the valet concluded his report, the Duke remained silent for several moments, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts as he gazed out the window at the immaculate gardens below. A lesser man might have erupted in fury, might have summoned his wife immediately to confront her with her betrayal, but the Duke of Blackwood had not maintained his position of power and influence through impulsive action. Instead, he considered the situation with the same calculated precision he applied to political maneuvers or financial investments, weighing various responses and their potential consequences. The kitchen boy, you say, he finally remarked, his voice dangerously soft. How utterly predictable that my wife would stoop so low in her desperation for attention. And this package, have you any idea what it contained? Simmons hesitated briefly. I cannot be certain, Your Grace, but given the timing and the planned departure, I suspect it may be the diamond and sapphire necklace presented to her grace on her birthday." The Duke's expression hardened, the only visible sign of his rage, the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the arm of his chair. "Rather than confronting my wife immediately," he said coldly after another calculated pause, "I believe we shall make an example of her paramour first. Let us see how devoted my wife remains when her lover rots in prison for theft." A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face as he elaborated on his strategy. "We shall alert the constables this morning, but keep Eleanor entirely unaware. Let her continue her daily routine, perhaps even planning for her grand escape, while her accomplice is arrested and charged with a crime that will see him transported or hanged." Simmons nodded approvingly, admiring as always his master's ability to craft punishment that served multiple purposes. "I shall send word to the magistrate immediately, Your Grace." The Duke rose from his chair, moving to the window to gaze down at the estate that bore his family name, generations of Blackwood power and privilege embodied in stone and land. "When the boy is arrested," he added as though considering a minor detail of a dinner menu, "ensure it happens in full view of the household staff. I want witnesses to his disgrace, and I want my wife to see the consequences of her foolishness firsthand." When Simmons had departed to carry out his instructions, the Duke remained at the window, his reflection in the glass revealing not the pain of a betrayed husband, but the cold fury of a man whose possession had dared assert independence. What his wife failed to understand, what she had never grasped throughout their marriage, was that he would sooner see everything he owned destroyed than surrendered to another, particularly something that bore his name and represented his legacy to the world. The morning that would shatter the fragile plans of Eleanor and Thomas dawned bright and clear, summer sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows and glinting off copper pots as the staff prepared breakfast for the household. Thomas moved among them with careful nonchalance, betraying nothing of the precious cargo hidden beneath the floorboards of his small chamber, nor the desperate hope that had sustained him through a sleepless night. 3 more days, he reminded himself as he chopped vegetables for the morning meal. 3 more days until freedom beckoned, until he could leave behind the rigid hierarchy that had determined his fate since birth. The sudden bang of the kitchen doors flying open startled everyone, conversation dying instantly as 2 constables in their distinctive uniforms entered, mud from their heavy boots streaking the scrubbed stone floor. Cook dropped her rolling pin with a clatter as they announced their purpose, their voices carrying an official weight that brought immediate silence. "We seek Thomas Harper, accused of the theft of Her Grace the Duchess of Blackwood's diamond and sapphire necklace," the taller constable declared, his gaze sweeping the room until it settled on Thomas, who stood frozen beside the preparation table, knife still in hand. The shock that coursed through him was visceral, his face draining of color, as understanding dawned. They had been discovered, betrayed by some unknown observer, their desperate plan collapsing before it had truly begun. The constables moved forward with grim purpose, seizing Thomas by the arms even as he struggled to maintain composure, his mind racing to comprehend how this had happened, how they could possibly know. The staff gathered in horrified clusters, whispers spreading like wildfire through the kitchen as Thomas found himself being dragged toward the main hall. "I did not steal anything. I swear it," he protested, the desperation in his voice genuine, even as he recognized the futility of his words against the power arrayed against him. The necklace had indeed been taken, though not stolen, the distinction meaningless in the eyes of the law when a servant possessed the property of nobility. The commotion drew attention throughout the manor, and as Thomas was pulled into the entrance hall, he saw Eleanor appear at the top of the grand staircase, her face a mask of horror as she comprehended the scene below. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment of silent communication that contained all their broken dreams and desperate love. He watched as a tear slid down her pale cheek, a single betrayal of emotion before she turned away, unable to bear witnessing his disgrace, yet powerless to stop it without condemning herself alongside him. The Duke materialized beside his wife, his tall figure imposing in his perfectly tailored morning coat, his expression revealing nothing as he observed the fruits of his calculated revenge. "Take the thief to await proper justice," he commanded, his deep voice carrying effortlessly to the furthest corners of the hall. Let it be known that crimes against the House of Blackwood will not go unpunished. Thomas felt himself being dragged backward toward the door, his last glimpse of Eleanor showing her gripping the banister with white-knuckled intensity as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. He wanted to call out to her, to somehow communicate that she should save herself, abandon their plans, deny any knowledge of his actions, but the words died in his throat as the great doors closed between them. As Thomas was led away across the gravel drive toward the waiting cart that would carry him to the magistrate, he realized with bitter clarity the perfect trap that had been laid. The Duke had chosen public humiliation rather than private confrontation, ensuring maximum witnesses to the servant's disgrace while carefully observing his wife's reaction. It was a masterful strategy that maintained the Duke's dignity while utterly destroying their dreams of escape. A cold-blooded revenge that demonstrated why the Blackwood name had commanded fear and respect for generations. The moments after Thomas's arrest passed in a blur for Eleanor, her body moving through the familiar patterns of aristocratic composure while her mind reeled with horror. She allowed herself to be guided back to her chambers by a concerned Martha, maintaining an expression of mild distress appropriate for a Duchess witnessing a disturbance among the staff, nothing more. Only when the heavy door closed behind them did Eleanor's careful facade crumble, her legs giving way as she collapsed onto the chaise longue, her entire body trembling with suppressed emotion. The betrayal, the timing, the public nature of the arrest, all bore the unmistakable hallmark of her husband's calculating cruelty. Martha moved quickly to prepare a cup of chamomile tea with trembling hands, her own face pale with worry as she watched her mistress pace the chamber like a trapped animal once she had regained the strength to stand. Eleanor's thoughts raced in frantic circles, seeking some explanation, some escape from the trap that had closed around them. The necklace remained hidden in Thomas's possession, damning evidence that would condemn him beyond any hope of redemption in the eyes of the law. "Martha, how quickly do theft cases proceed when nobility is involved?" Eleanor asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper as she paused before the window, staring blindly at the gardens below where she had first encountered Thomas in what now seemed another lifetime. The maid hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver more distressing news. "I heard from Mr. Phillips that the magistrate has already been summoned, Your Grace," Martha finally admitted, her voice heavy with dread. "They plan to try him tomorrow morning at first light." An unusually swift proceeding, driven no doubt by the Duke's influence. Eleanor pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, as though seeking to absorb some strength from its solid presence. "He will hang for a crime he did not commit," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as the full horror of their situation crashed over her. "Worse still, his mother and sister will lose their sole means of support." Martha approached cautiously, her loyalty to Eleanor warring with her lifelong understanding of the rigid social order that governed their world. "If you speak the truth, Your Grace, you will face your husband's wrath," she warned softly, her eyes reflecting genuine concern for the woman she had served since Eleanor's marriage. The Duke is not known for his mercy, even toward those of his own class, let alone his wife. Eleanor turned from the window, her expression shifting from despair to a strange, calm resolution as she considered her options with newfound clarity. What remained for her at Blackwood Manor? Years of cold contempt, of being valued only for the children she had thus far failed to produce, of existing as an ornament to a man who saw her as nothing more than another possession to be controlled and displayed. Against this stood the certain knowledge that her silence would condemn an innocent man to death, a man whose only crime had been to see her as a person worthy of love and respect rather than as the Duchess of Blackwood. "If I remain silent, I condemn not only Thomas but my own soul," Eleanor said quietly, moving to her dressing table where she began to remove the pins from her hair with deliberate care, as though preparing for a significant occasion rather than the potential destruction of her social existence. "I have lived in fear of my husband for 5 years, Martha. Perhaps it is time I discovered whether there are worse fates than his disapproval." The maid watched with growing alarm as Eleanor methodically changed from her morning dress into the most formal of her day gowns, a deep blue creation that lent authority to her slender figure. "Her Grace, I beg you to reconsider," Martha pleaded, recognizing the determination that had transformed her mistress's face from its usual mask of resigned politeness to something altogether more formidable. "The consequences, should you interfere," the maid continued, only to be silenced by Eleanor's raised hand. "There are worse prisons than disgrace, Martha," Eleanor stated with quiet conviction, securing her hair in a simple but elegant arrangement that emphasized the newfound strength in her bearing. "And I have been imprisoned long enough." The village courthouse stood at the center of town, a stolid stone structure dating from the previous century, its interior dominated by dark oak panels and worn benches, where the local population now pressed together in unprecedented numbers, drawn by rumors of theft, aristocracy, and scandal. The early morning sunlight slanted through narrow windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air as Magistrate Sir William Pembroke took his place on the raised dais, his expression grave beneath his white powdered wig. Thomas Harper stood in the dock, his wrists bound by iron shackles, yet his bearing remained dignified despite the night spent in the dank village jail cell and the hostile murmurs that rippled through the crowd. He had refused the traditional defendant's garb of sackcloth, instead appearing in his own clean shirt and waistcoat, his face composed though pale as he surveyed the packed courtroom, his gaze never wavering even when the Duke of Blackwood made his entrance through a side door, commanding immediate attention without speaking a word. The proceedings began with formal charges, the clerk reading out the accusation in sonorous tones that echoed against stone walls, the theft of a diamond and sapphire necklace valued at 800 guineas from Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood, a crime punishable by death or transportation. When asked how he pled, Thomas spoke clearly, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room as he stated, "Not guilty, Your Worship," without elaboration or plea for mercy, maintaining the quiet dignity that had caught Eleanor's attention those many weeks ago in the garden. The Duke took the stand with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deference, recounting how the valuable necklace had been discovered missing, how certain evidence had come to light, suggesting the kitchen boy's involvement, his testimony delivered with such apparent reluctance and restraint that it seemed more damning than any passionate accusation could have been. As he produced a handkerchief embroidered with the Duchess's initials, claiming it had been found among Thomas's possessions along with a sketched map showing the route to Portsmouth, the courtroom erupted in fresh murmurs, the case against the young servant seeming irrefutable in its detail and consistency. The magistrate had just turned to address Thomas directly, asking if he had anything to say in his defense, when the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courthouse swung open with dramatic force. A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd as the Duchess of Blackwood herself appeared in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the morning light, before she stepped forward into the hushed courtroom. Eleanor moved with measured grace down the central aisle, her blue gown rustling softly against the rough wooden floor, her gaze fixed directly ahead as whispers followed her progress. The Duke half rose from his seat, his expression flickering between surprise and cold fury before settling into a mask of aristocratic composure that nevertheless failed to disguise the dangerous glitter in his eyes. "Your Worship," Eleanor addressed the magistrate directly, ignoring both her husband's presence and the scandalized murmurs of the spectators. "I have something to say regarding this case," her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. Determination evident in her straight spine and lifted chin despite the fear that threatened to close her throat entirely. The magistrate, clearly flustered by this unexpected development, looked from the Duchess to the Duke and back again, court protocol, offering no clear guidance for this unprecedented situation. The room held its collective breath, the air thick with tension as Eleanor stood before the court, poised on the knife edge of decision, knowing that her next words would irrevocably alter not only Thomas's fate, but her own, the familiar constraints of her life about to shatter beneath the weight of the truth she had come to speak. The courthouse fell into stunned silence as Eleanor stood before the magistrate, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. "Thomas Harper is innocent," she declared, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I gave him the necklace willingly. It was not stolen but freely bestowed." Gasps echoed through the courtroom, the spectators' shock almost palpable as this aristocratic lady publicly aligned herself with a kitchen servant. Eleanor continued before anyone could interrupt. years of silent submission giving way to determined clarity. The jewels were presented to me as a gift from my husband, and as such became my property to dispose of as I wished. I chose to give them to Thomas Harper, not as payment for services or under any form of coercion, but as a free exercise of my right to bestow my personal possessions. The Duke rose to his feet, his face contorted with barely controlled rage as he moved toward his wife. "Your Grace," the magistrate intervened, clearly flustered by this unprecedented turn of events, "this is most irregular. Are you suggesting that you authorized the removal of these valuable jewels from Blackwood Manor?" "I did not merely authorize it, Sir William," Eleanor replied, meeting the magistrate's gaze directly. "I initiated it. The necklace was mine to give, and I gave it freely." The assembled crowd erupted in whispers and exclamations, the villagers never having witnessed such a public division between nobility, particularly not one that involved a servant. Thomas stood silently in the dock, his expression a mixture of awe and despair as he watched Eleanor sacrifice her reputation and security for his freedom. The Duke reached his wife, grasping her arm with fingers that would surely leave bruises, his voice lowered to a furious hiss that nonetheless carried to those nearest. "You have made a spectacle of yourself and this family. Have you taken complete leave of your senses?" Eleanor did not flinch from his touch or his anger, something new and unbreakable having formed within her during the desperate night following Thomas's arrest. "No," she responded, her voice soft but firm, audible in the hushed courtroom. "I have finally found my voice. Through 5 years of marriage, I have been silent, decorative, obedient. Today I speak the truth, regardless of the consequences." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she remained standing tall, her gaze never wavering as she addressed the magistrate once more. "If there is any crime here, Sir William, it lies with me, not with this man. I alone made the decision to dispose of my jewels as I saw fit. If the law requires punishment for this act, then it should fall upon my shoulders, not his." Throughout the courtroom, women of all stations exchanged glances of mingled shock and admiration, while the men shifted uncomfortably, the Duchess' unprecedented declaration, challenging the very foundations of property and marriage that governed their society. The magistrate cleared his throat repeatedly, clearly at a loss for how to proceed in a case that had transformed from simple theft into something far more complex and potentially scandalous, involving not just aristocratic property, but aristocratic marriage, and a woman's right to self-determination. The magistrate's ruling, delivered with evident discomfort, formally cleared Thomas of theft charges based on the Duchess's testimony, though he added stern warnings about servants accepting valuable gifts from their betters, a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed legal proceedings to conclude without further scandal. The Duke's face remained impassive throughout, only the whiteness of his knuckles betraying the rage that simmered beneath his composed exterior as he escorted Eleanor from the courthouse with a grip that brooked no resistance. The carriage journey back to Blackwood Manor passed in ominous silence, the Duke seated opposite his wife, watching her with the cold calculation of a predator assessing its prey. Eleanor felt the familiar fear rising within her chest, but forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the knowledge that her actions, whatever their cost to herself, had secured Thomas's freedom. Only when the carriage doors closed behind them in the private confines of his study did the Duke's control finally shatter. "You have humiliated me before the entire county," he snarled, pacing the room like a caged tiger while Eleanor stood motionless before his desk. "Years of careful cultivation of the Blackwood reputation, tarnished by your hysterical display of sentiment for a kitchen boy." Eleanor flinched at his tone but held her ground, the newfound courage that had carried her through the courtroom sustaining her still. "I spoke only the truth," she replied simply. "The necklace was mine to give." The Duke laughed, a harsh sound entirely devoid of humor. "Your truth," he spat, turning to face her with contempt etching lines into his aristocratic features. "Let me share mine with equal candor. I never loved you, Eleanor. I married you for your family connections and the prospect of strong heirs, nothing more. You were a transaction, an investment that has thus far failed to yield returns." Her heart should have broken at these words, But Eleanor found herself strangely unmoved, as though she had always known this truth, but had lacked the courage to acknowledge it, even to herself. "And now you threaten that investment further with your ridiculous infatuation." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your family stands on the brink of financial ruin. Did you know that? One word from me to my banking associates, and your father's remaining enterprises collapse. Your brothers, sisters, cousins, all dependent on the Blackwood goodwill you have so carelessly squandered today." Eleanor paled at this revelation, the implications for her family striking her with physical force, yet she did not waver. "What would you have me do?" she asked, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the study. "Recant your statement publicly," he replied immediately. "Claim temporary hysteria, female weakness, whatever excuse might salvage something of our dignity. Admit that the boy manipulated you, played upon your sympathies to secure the jewels." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, weighing her choices, though in her heart she already knew her answer. When she opened them again, she faced her husband with newfound clarity. "I will not lie to protect your pride," she stated quietly. "Do what you will to me, but Thomas must go free. I have spoken truth in open court, and I will not recall it." The Duke studied her with narrowed eyes, as though seeing her truly for the first time in their 5 years of marriage, recognition of her unexpected strength bringing not respect but calculated reassessment of his approach. "You've embarrassed me publicly," he said coldly. "There will be consequences, Eleanor. Make no mistake about that. But I am not so foolish as to create further scandal by pursuing this matter. The boy will go free, yes, but he will never work in any respectable household in England again. As for you," he continued, moving to pour himself a measure of brandy with deliberate calm that somehow proved more frightening than his earlier rage, "you have earned yourself a period of extended reflection on your duties as my wife and a duchess. Perhaps seclusion at our northern estate will provide opportunity for such contemplation." Eleanor recognized the threat behind his words, the isolation he planned as her punishment, yet she found herself drawing strength from the very act of defiance that had brought her to this point. The woman who had entered the courthouse that morning was not the same one who now faced her husband's wrath, her spirit awakened by love and fortified by the courage to speak truth regardless of consequence. The midnight hour found Eleanor seated at her window, watching shadows shift across the moonlit gardens of Blackwood Manor, her mind consumed with worry for Thomas's fate. The Duke had retreated to London immediately after their confrontation, citing parliamentary business but clearly seeking distance from the scandal that now surrounded his household. His parting instructions to the staff had effectively placed Eleanor under house arrest, with servants instructed to monitor her movements and deny her access to horses or carriages under the guise of concern for her delicate state of mind. A soft knock at her chamber door roused Eleanor from her troubled contemplation, and she turned to find Martha slipping quietly into the room, her face tense with nervous energy. "Your Grace," the maid whispered, checking the corridor before closing the door securely behind her. "I bring news of Thomas." Eleanor rose immediately, crossing the room in swift strides, hope and fear warring in her expression. "He was released as ordered but remains in danger while in the vicinity of Blackwood lands," Martha continued, her voice barely audible despite the late hour and empty corridors. "He has taken refuge with his mother's cousin in Millfield, beyond the Duke's immediate influence, but cannot secure passage to Portsmouth without funds or references." Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed, relief at Thomas's freedom mingling with despair at the insurmountable obstacles that remained. The necklace, their only resource, had been returned to the Duke's possession, and she herself was virtually a prisoner in her own home, with no means to communicate with or assist the man for whom she had risked everything. Her desperate reflections were interrupted by another knock, this one firmer and more authoritative, causing Martha to freeze in alarm before hurriedly assuming the posture of a maid attending to evening duties. When Eleanor called permission to enter, the door swung open to reveal a figure that momentarily startled both women with its unexpected appearance. Lady Victoria Winthrop, the Duke's widowed sister, stood in the doorway, her commanding presence seeming to fill the room despite her slight stature. At 55, her once auburn hair now threaded with silver. She remained a formidable woman whose sharp intelligence had made her a force in London society despite the limitations placed on her gender. "Martha, you may leave us," Lady Winthrop instructed, her tone brooking no argument, despite having no technical authority over Blackwood's staff. Once alone with Eleanor, Victoria closed the door firmly and approached her sister-in-law with an appraising gaze. "Well, my dear," she began without preamble, "you have certainly caused quite a stir. I received 3 separate letters from London acquaintances before I had even finished my morning chocolate, all detailing your courtroom declaration with varying degrees of accuracy." Eleanor stiffened, preparing herself for condemnation from this unexpected quarter, only to be surprised by the faint smile that crossed Victoria's lined face. "Courage has always been in short supply among the women who marry into the Blackwood family, myself included," Victoria continued, seating herself beside Eleanor on the bed with a familiarity they had never before shared. "I find myself rather admiringly scandalized by your actions." When Eleanor remained speechless with surprise, Victoria patted her hand with unexpected gentleness. "I, too, once found myself drawn to someone deemed unsuitable by my family," she confessed, her voice softening with the weight of old memories. "A tutor employed to improve my Italian before my first season. Unlike you, I lacked the courage to defy my father when he dismissed the young man without references. I have often wondered what became of him, and of the woman I might have been had I found the strength you demonstrated today. My brother has always been cruel, Eleanor," Victoria continued, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Even as a child, he took pleasure in power and control above all else. Perhaps it is time someone stood against him, and I find myself surprisingly pleased that it should be you, the quiet bride everyone underestimated." Eleanor stared at her sister-in-law, scarcely able to believe this unexpected alliance. "But what can be done?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Duke controls everything. My movements, my resources, my future." A slow, determined smile spread across Victoria's face, revealing a family resemblance to the Duke that had never before been apparent, though in her it spoke of resolution rather than cruelty. "I am not without resources or connections of my own, my dear," she replied. "And unlike my brother, I have always believed that a woman deserves the right to determine her own destiny, even when that destiny defies convention." The summer rain that had threatened since dawn finally broke as Eleanor's carriage reached the crest of the hill overlooking Blackwood lands for what she knew would be the final time. 3 months had passed since her dramatic courthouse declaration, months of legal maneuvers, private investigations, and delicate negotiations orchestrated by Lady Winthrop with formidable efficiency. Eleanor watched raindrops trace patterns on the carriage window, each mile increasing the distance between herself and the life that had held her captive for 5 years. The Duke had underestimated his sister's influence and determination, never imagining that Victoria would not only stand as Eleanor's champion, but would methodically document his years of emotional cruelty, gathering testimony from servants and acquaintances alike to build an unassailable case. When presented with evidence that could destroy not only his reputation, but potentially his political career, the Duke had grudgingly agreed to an annulment on grounds of non-consummation, a face-saving fiction that preserved his pride while granting Eleanor her freedom without the scandal of divorce. The carriage slowed as it approached a small country inn, where a familiar figure waited beneath the shelter of an ancient oak tree, his tall form immediately recognizable, despite the simple gentleman's clothing that had replaced his servant's garb. Thomas Harper stepped forward as the carriage door opened, his face transforming with joy at the sight of Eleanor, though propriety kept him from reaching for her until they were safely inside the vehicle and moving once more along the rain-soaked road. "These past weeks," he began, his voice rough with emotion as they settled side by side on the carriage seat, "I feared the Duke might still find some way to prevent your freedom." "He has tried," Eleanor admitted, removing her gloves to reveal hands free of wedding rings or ducal crests. "But your new employer proved more formidable than even he anticipated. Lady Winthrop not only secured my annulment but has arranged for your position as her secretary and companion, a role that finally puts your education to proper use." Thomas smiled, still marveling at the unexpected turn their fortunes had taken. "Who would have imagined that the fearsome Lady Winthrop would become our champion?" he said softly, reaching hesitantly to take Eleanor's hand in his, the touch still new and wondrous despite the depth of feeling between them. "Her country estate near the Scottish border will provide safe harbour, while society gossip runs its inevitable course," Eleanor replied, her fingers interlacing with his. "In time, perhaps a year or two, we might consider a quieter life elsewhere, perhaps even America as we once dreamed, but for now, we have honest work, comfortable accommodation, and most importantly, our freedom." The rain eased as they traveled northward, the first hints of sunrise breaking through clouds on the eastern horizon, painting the countryside in soft golden light that seemed to herald new beginnings. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's profile, noting how the worry lines that had marked his face during their secret meetings at Blackwood had eased, replaced by an expression of quiet contentment that matched the peace growing within her own heart. "We are neither servant nor Duchess now," Thomas observed as they watched the sunrise from the carriage window, his voice filled with wonder at the transformation of their circumstances. "No," Eleanor agreed softly, turning to meet his gaze with newfound serenity. "We are simply two people who found the courage to choose their own fate." In the gentle light of dawn, as the carriage carried them toward a future neither could have imagined in the rigid world of Blackwood Manor, Eleanor rested her head against Thomas's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that while society might forever whisper about the Duchess who wept as they dragged the cookboy to prison for theft, then confessed she had given him her jewels willingly, only they would know the full truth, that in losing everything deemed valuable by the world, they had gained the only treasure that truly mattered, the freedom to love and be loved for themselves alone.